Divine Truth Events. These are events and presentations by Jesus and Mary. This presentation is part of the General Question series, and it is a question and answer session from people in Kentucky. Presented by Jesus on the 7th of September 2013 in Kentucky, New South Wales, Australia. This is part 1.
So maybe I'll write them down, shall I?
Thank you. That'd be great.
So the first thing you said was acknowledge the terror. Okay? That's the very first thing. And the second thing is
your beliefs or justifications or ways to get away from your terror.
beliefs and methods used to avoid terror. And remember, it's to avoid the experience of terror.
Yeah.
Does it make sense?
Yeah.
So what we're doing here is we're being honest with ourselves about the techniques and the belief systems that we have that cause us to avoid our terror. Now, for the majority of us, we have these very strong belief systems that are very much surrounding the feeling of terror. In other words, we say we shouldn't have to feel terror. We shouldn't have to feel fear. Other people, the person who hurt me should have to feel it. And this is why some people even revert to violence against the person who hurt them, because they want the person who hurt them to feel as bad as they feel, right? But all of that doesn't help you heal any of the abuse. No. And this, by the way, this applies to both sexual and other forms of abuse. So violent abuse, for example, it also applies to, right? So it applies to all sorts of abuse. Obviously, when it's sexual in nature, there are additional issues that a person has to cope with that are not the same with violent abuse. Does that make sense? But there are still large amounts of terror. Right? So you see many men who are adults who have grown up with a violent father who was a drinker and come home drunk and beat up mum and beat up the kids and all that kind of scenario. You see many men who have grown up in that, although they weren't sexually abused by their father, they still will have this kind of terror in them. Does that make sense? And this kind of terror has to be released if you ever want to be free, if you ever want to feel a sense of freedom. Now, the only way to release terror is to feel it. Right? That's the problem. And in fact, what we did most of the time was we tried to avoid feeling it when we were children. And in fact, many times spirits who were guiding us at the time also tried to help you avoid it as well. And the main reason why they do that is because they try to help you not have as much trauma. Does that make sense? But unfortunately, it also causes, to a degree, this detunement thing that goes on, where we don't remember certain things about the abuse. We remember it beginning and it ending, but we don't remember much in between many times. And the reason why we don't remember much in between a lot of the times is because we're out of body already by that time, and so and in a safe location sort of thing, and the problems were just happening to our body at that point. So we need to understand that the memories of both violent and sexual abuse are not going to be as defined as your normal memories.
Okay.
Right? So this is something that you need to be aware of when you've been abused as well. They're not going to be as defined because you wanted to get away from them while they were occurring. And many times you were assisted to get away from them by spirits and people who wanted to come to your rescue. Does that make sense? Spirit people who wanted to come to your rescue. And not all of them were people who were trying to help you, by the way. They're just people often who were in the same position as yourself when they were on Earth, and they're trying to avoid their stuff as much as what they're trying to help you avoid yours.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah. Now, so acknowledge the terror. So this is number one. Most people who have been abused barely do that. Right? And what are the beliefs and methods you use to avoid the terror? Most people are so much automated in this space that they're not even really conscious of what they do to avoid the terror. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's only been a process that I'm discovering now. You know, I've been I've actually felt terror, the big anxiety in my body for the first time in the last couple of months. You know, before that, I was gone before that was even allowed.
Yes.
And now it's like, all right, it's a sign.
Yep. So allow yourself now, and if it was me, most people who've been abused don't want to do something positively and directly towards fixing the abuse.
Yeah, I'd agree.
What they want to do instead is avoid it.
Yeah.
Avoid the knowledge of it, avoid the fact that it happened, and there's a big fear that they might re-experience a whole heap of things that they don't want to experience and so forth, which is not really possible because you're an adult now and most of the abuse usually occurred during childhood. So it's not really possible to re-experience something as an adult that you had experienced as a child. All you can do is really remember it from an emotional perspective. But we tell ourselves that I'm going to reinfect myself with the past, or we tell ourselves I'm over the past. Right? But every single day shows you're not over the past, but you're over it, right? Yeah. And so this is where we've got to be very sincere with ourselves about what we actually do now, right? Now, number 3 is to remember that it is an act of love towards yourself to feel your own feelings. Does everyone get what I mean by that? Yeah. So whenever we tell ourselves, I shouldn't have to feel that, you're really in that moment engaged in telling yourself a false thing about love of self. Because love of self really says, whatever is in me, if I love myself, I'll feel it. I'll honour that was my experience. See, for many people who have been either violently or sexually abused, they want to forget those parts of their life. The problem with forgetting those parts of their life is that they are actually now forgetting lots of things that have formed their current life. So you're sort of running away from what has been a part of forming you as you currently are. Now, if you love yourself, you wouldn't do that. You would honour that. Does that make sense? Is there a second roving mic? Because I'd like to keep the mic with Eloisa, who I'm answering the question, and maybe just get out a second one and we can just get comments from other people. Keep the mic with you, Eloisa. We'll come down to Matt down here.
Hi, AJ. With that number 3, sometimes I get this feeling of like, I guess it happened at those kind of events of like, don't you dare feel those things.
Yeah, no, that's not your feelings. That spirit's with you.
Yeah.
And spirit, the problem is it's so easy for spirits with you to tell you not to feel things because you don't want to feel them.
No, I don't.
So a spirit who's a pedophile just comes along and says, don't you dare feel it. I'm going to make your life hard if you feel it. And you go, okay.
Yeah.
It's like having a mate who's next to you saying, don't feel. And you go, yeah, no worries, because you don't want to feel anyway.
Not really, no.
So that only happens because of the lack of will to feel. Does that make sense?
That's my problem.
That's the problem. The problem is that you don't see feeling these emotions as an act of love towards yourself. You see it as a chore, as something to avoid. And to be honest with you, most people who have experienced any form of abuse feel the same way. They feel that it's just something they should avoid. Does that make sense?
I think I'm guessing it probably happens a lot for other people who've experienced abuse is then they bounce from one to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, and like I'll realise, oh, I'm eating just to avoid, and then 5 minutes later I'm thinking about something else to avoid, and it gets so tiring and it's so unfulfilling, and I hate doing it, but I love doing it at the same time.
Well, you love doing it because you want to
effects.
avoid this one emotion.
Yes.
So all of these techniques are techniques that you've learned and you now purposefully use to avoid that one emotion.
Why do I want to avoid it so much though?
Well, that's the question you need to ask yourself. And what I'm saying to you is partly it's because of your beliefs about feeling it. So part of the beliefs, remember part of the beliefs we talked about with Eloise were beliefs such as, I didn't abuse myself, somebody abused me, they should have to feel what I feel. They should have to do the work, not me. They should be punished first. Why aren't they being punished? And we even get things angry with God. Why hasn't God punished them for doing what they chose to do? Rather than me having to feel. It feels like I'm the one getting punished. Now, all of these belief systems are supportive to you not feeling your terror. And they're also not necessarily true, many of them. So, for example, a person who's a pedophile, when they arrive in the spirit world, because most of the time they don't cure it while on earth, they arrive in the spirit world, they are in some of the darkest places you can imagine, and they stay there for thousands of years because of what they did, many of them, right? So you thinking that God hasn't done anything about it is not true either. All of God's laws are trying to correct them as well. So a lot of the times we believe certain things about the universe and about God and about ourselves that are all not true. Like the belief that you're not capable to experience terror is not true. Like I can say that because I've had to go through all of these issues of abuse myself. And, I was tortured in the first century and I have all the memories about that, which is and I was sexually as well as violently tortured in the first century. So I had to go through all the memories about that, right? So, and I've been able to go through them all by choosing to do these things. I've gone to some, as I've said in other talks, I've gone to some things like advocates of childhood sexual abuse survivors, and things like that. And sometimes I've gone to those kind of meetings for years, and what I found was the majority of them do not want to do this. And that's why they never heal. And I've known of people who, there's one person, 10 years later I visited him, after meeting him 10 years prior. 10 years later I visited him, and he was no different. He'd been going to a psychologist for 10 years, and he'd been going to these meetings for a childhood abuse for 10 years, and after 10 years, he was no different than when I first met him. He had exactly the same problems. His life was exactly the same. He had exactly the same issues emotionally. He had exactly the same attractions. And 10 years later, and he thinks that he'd been doing all that work, but he hadn't been doing this. Right? That's the big problem. Yeah? If you just pass your mic straight back.
Can we use grief as the excuse for avoiding the terror as well? We can go straight into the tears and the grief, but not actually feel the terror?
I think you can, certainly. Of course, the grief won't be associated generally with the experience a lot of the times. A lot of times the grief will be associated with things like rebelling against the experience. Does that make sense? In other words, we're basically having a tantrum about having to feel the feelings rather than feel the feelings themselves. Right? And this is very hard for a person who's been abused because there is this very strong feeling in them that somebody else did it to them, so somebody else should have to pay. Right? That's the feeling. And that's the feeling that usually drives the avoidance. The fact that somebody else should have to do it, somebody else should have to pay, rather than you do it yourself.
So the grief is actually the tantrum?
Oftentimes the grief can be the tantrum, particularly if you haven't felt some of the fear yet. Yeah. It often is the tantrum.
Because it's like an incredible opportunity to just skip the terror and get into the grief.
Exactly. But while the terror remains in you, your attractions will remain. Yeah. your life will keep attracting the same kind of events, particularly if it's a sexual abuse, then it will attract similar events sexually. If it's violent physical abuse, it will attract certain events physically. And this will be showing you that nothing much has really changed. Many people, of course, choose to make a comfortable life in that place. So what they do is they construct their life in such a way that they get to not have a partner, because having a partner is too traumatic sexually. They get to not have any interactions with any person who might have any effect on them in terms of helping them remember the violence or the sexual violence that has occurred to them. And so what they finished up doing is creating a very constrained life. Last week I called it making your own prison, and then thinking that you're you're safe, right? But it's actually a prison, that's constraining you. And that's what most people who have been abused physically finish up doing in their life. So this is why many of them end up alone, or they end up with a person who's in a relationship with other people who are either like what you would call abusive sexually, or completely uninterested sexually. In other words, it's very rare to have a pure loving sexual relationship if a person's been sexually abused. And the reason why is because we don't want to get into certain emotions. It always comes down to that. Does that make sense? So there's more points I want to raise here, but if we can see that we need to firstly acknowledge that the terror exists. And if you have had a violent childhood where your parent, one or both parents, were violent at any time, there will be terror in you. It's unavoidable, actually. There will be terror in you. The majority of the times it was shut down from expression. In other words, you weren't allowed to express it at the time, right? And because they just got more violent. If you expressed it at the time, they just get more violent or, do more things to you. And then, of course, it just feels more frightening. And so what you learn to do is to not experience it, to not feel it, right? This is the problem. So we now acknowledge that the terror must exist. And this is something we need to bear in mind. If we've had a father that was just getting drunk every night, coming home beating up mum, you've got to at some point even intellectually acknowledge that you must have terror in you. Because it can have no other effect on you than cause some terror within you, right? So we acknowledge that. Then what we do is we start examining and be sincere in our examination of what are the belief systems that we have and what are the methods we use to avoid the experience of that emotion. Right? And that ranges from belief systems, right from one kind of belief system which are all like, it's all their fault, I hate them, they've got to fix it, I'm never going to deal with it, they're going to have to deal with it first, they're going to have to come and apologise to me. But even if they came and were totally sorry for what they'd done, the emotion would still be in you. That's the sad thing about this. Because the emotions that are not felt stay within you. And that's the problem. And it's the emotions that stay within you that cause the damage to the rest of your life. So if you love yourself, coming to the third point, if you love yourself, you must choose to feel these emotions at some point. Right? Now, can you see that if you chose to feel the emotions, you would not revert to getting out of your body and having spirits come in. You wouldn't revert to these methods and belief systems that you choose to avoid, right? So whenever you, like you said, Matt, earlier, you go from one to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, and then back to the beginning when all the others have failed and cycle through all of these methods of avoidance, right? And it just feels like a cat chasing its tail sort of thing, or a dog, I suppose. I've never seen a cat do it, but chasing its tail. And that's how we often, and then after years of that, and most of the people who have been abused have had years of that. And so most of their life has ended up just this never-ending cycle of avoidance. Right? Now, the problem with a lot of therapy with abuse is that it also helps you in some methods of avoidance. So one method of avoidance is to tell your story without feeling your feelings. And many people who have had abused pasts often get into this addictive process of telling their story about the abuse without feeling the feelings associated with the abuse. Yeah. And so sometimes we'll go along to some kind of a therapist, and you'll be talking to them about your abuse, and there's not a tear, there's no fear, there's no terror. This has just happened to me. I know it's happened to me. This is what happened. And they're trying. The therapist initially might be trying to help you get into the emotions of it, to feel about it. But often the avoidance of the terror is the thing which is the doorway into all the other emotions. The terror is the doorway into all the other emotions, the grief and other emotions associated with and even a lot of the anger associated with the event will be blocked by the terror. And yet we don't see it like that. We sort of see it as the thing to avoid. So unfortunately, we have a tendency then, when we've been abused, to avoid any emotional expression regarding the abuse. If we can't manage that, the other thing that we do is not talk about it at all. So we avoid both things. We also generally, depending on the type of abuse, either avoid or engage promiscuously in sexual acts that the abuse was also engaged in. So the abuser was also engaged in with us. In other words, we feel turned on by things that the abuser did, or we feel totally repelled by anything that the abuser did. Does that make sense? Yeah. And again, we're avoiding the terror of acknowledging those feelings. Right? So you can see straight away that if we did the first three things, we'd already have been progressed, wouldn't you, into dealing with quite a lot already, if we just come across to Philippa.
AJ, just on number 3, our lack of will to feel feelings, that's directly related to our lack of love for ourselves?
Mm-hmm. Always. Yes? What drove the question, Philippa?
My lack of will.
Yeah. So if you really love yourself, you will want to get rid of from yourself any emotion that is harming your life. And in our childhoods, many of us have had many emotions that were stored through a process of events the environment took. So for example, we started to cry, but the parent said, "I'm going to give you something to cry about now," and you get so afraid, so you stop crying. Now that crying, those tears have been shut down. Those tears will have to be experienced at some point in the future. They were there to be experienced. They're now locked down inside of you. They're like frozen emotion. And in fact, when those emotions come up, you will often feel the age of the emotion. So for example, you might start crying and it feels like you're 2 years old crying. And that's an emotion that you didn't feel when you were 2 years old, that you needed to feel. That was shut down. Now, the average parent on the planet shuts down most of the child's emotion throughout of its life, right? That's fairly normal. We often still see that as normal. And as a result of that, we learn to not feel anything. We're taught to not feel. But we need to see that it's an act of love towards ourselves to feel, to allow ourselves to feel what we actually feel. And if we're not willing to do it, then we're not willing to love ourselves. If we're not willing to love ourselves, it's going to be very hard to grow towards God, because God wants you to love yourself. God wants to love you, and God also wants you to love yourself. And if you're unwilling to love yourself, you're out of harmony with the way God sees you. Right? So it's going to be very hard to be at one with God while you're unwilling to love yourself. And part of being willing to love yourself is to remember that it's an act of love towards yourself to feel what you feel inside. That's an act of love towards yourself. That's partly what it means to love yourself. And in fact, it's a large part of what it means to love yourself. Yeah. So we just go straight across there.
Hi. You said feel your own feelings, but and I don't know if this is just I'm avoiding it, but I have felt that like I was feeling my feelings, and then all of a sudden I'm feeling somebody else's experience, and I say, no, I'm not feeling that, because that's not my experience. Should I still, even though I feel it's not my experience, that it's in me and I should just continue?
Definitely not. You've got to understand that every time you are feeling somebody else's experience, it's because you were choosing to not feel your own.
Right. So at one stage, while I felt like I was feeling my own feelings...
And then all of a sudden it turned into someone else's experience.
Yes.
Now there was something in between those that transition that occurred where you didn't want to feel anymore.
Okay, there was that.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get you, yes.
And that's what you've got to identify. What caused the switch between you feeling yourself and then you feeling someone else?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Any hints on how to do that? Because it just seems like seamless.
Well, yeah, often when we begin it does seem seamless, like it seems like, it just happened. But it never just happens.
Yeah.
It always happens through a choice you make in your heart, the feeling in your feelings. So you might start feeling a certain thing, and I'll give you some clues as to what it could be, but I need you to feel about it, because in the end you're the one who's got to be responsible for determining why you're trying to get away from your own feelings. Sure. Does that make sense?
Yep.
But sometimes it's because we start feeling something, it feels like it's going to be too intense.
Yes.
Right? And so in that moment, we're now terrified, so what do? We go into... we're telling ourselves still, though, it's good to feel.
Yeah.
But we've already just started avoiding our own feelings.
Right.
So who's going to come along and help us feel? Or feel something through us? Probably a spirit of some kind come along, connect to us, feel something through us. That just before we made that choice, that switch, we need to see what we did. It could be another belief, like it could be, I shouldn't have to feel this. Just that feeling, I shouldn't have to feel this. Right. Causes me to attract somebody else feeling their stuff through me. Or it could be, I'm feeling this because I know it's the only way to grow, so I have to do it.
Have to do it.
I have to do it. The attitude of I have to do it is always generally going to attract somebody else doing it through you.
That's my big emotion. I have to do this.
Yeah. You either want to or you don't. Which one is it? Right? So for the majority of people who start to feel emotions regarding their childhood abuse, they feel a little bit and then it starts feeling a bit intense, and so then they don't feel like they want to. Here, in their heart, they don't feel like they want to, but they feel like they have to. So they try to force themselves now to feel something that they don't want to feel anymore, rather than acknowledging they don't want to. Right? In that process, oftentimes a spirit will come, overcloak the person, and the spirit will feel its emotions through the person. Does no good to you at all. You can process for hours like that and you'll process nothing. And you'll just create a mess generally in your life if you keep doing that, right? So that's not much good for you. What you need to do instead is you need to go, okay, stop. I can feel this is somebody else's emotion now. Stop. And then ask yourself, what happened just before the transition occurred? Just before the transition, when you were feeling your own stuff and then you were feeling somebody else's. What happened in there? What caused that transition? A lot of times what causes it is we desire somebody else to feel with us. So we want people to share in our emotions with us. This is a big problem actually for many people who've been abused. They want people around them who have not been abused to understand their abuse. To be honest with you, if you've been abused, no one around you who has not been abused will ever understand what it feels like, because they haven't experienced it. They're not going to understand. So it's impossible for them to understand what you've been through. So why are you trying to have them understand? Can you see that has to be an addiction to have a sharing of the experience? A feeling that if you share the experience and they understand that they'll approve of it somehow or approve of you somehow. There's some addiction involved in that. And every time an addiction switches into play, you'll move from feeling your own feelings to sharing an experience with somebody else. Does that make sense? Yeah. And most people, it happens within the first 5 seconds of feeling. They start being overwhelmed by a feeling, and within 5 seconds later, they're already feeling someone else's feelings. Right? Because that's how strongly they want to avoid their own feelings. Right? Okay. Okay, if we bring down to Erica.
Thank you. Each time I'm trying to feel, in my head, I have things about how about forgiveness, because I hate my parents, and I tell how I feel about them, and then they tricks me if any angles, and I feel like I should forgive them, and I'm not loving them at all.
Can I talk about forgiveness as a separate subject to this? Because while forgiveness needs to be part of the process that any person who's abused goes through, it can't actually be resolved unless you're prepared to go through some of these feelings.
Yeah.
So every time you try to jump ahead to forgiveness, there is going to be an issue. All right? So we need to talk about forgiveness and how forgiveness actually occurs as a separate issue to what we're talking about here, I feel. Is that okay with you? Yeah? So we'll talk about, I'll just write up there just to remind me. Oops. Spelling is always a problem. I'll just put that up there and we'll talk about that. Yep. Who is next?